Right, welcome to my talk at the DevJam Conference 2022. I decided to go this time around with a less technical topic and more maybe of a philosophical one. So the question is, what is Agile, what is Agility, and how can we work with them during our day-by-day life? Some warnings at the beginning. This is heavily opinionated, so it is based on my experience. Your experience might vary, and my goal is to not offer any answer. I'm going to share opinions, maybe we can have a discussion about it, but I will try to not make any point. Some things about myself. Hi, my name is Petrella. I'm a developer here at SciTech. I also have experience as a Scrum Master. I am a PC gamer and I do play the bass guitar. Okay, let's start with some definition. What do I mean by Agile? I really like this definition by Agile Alliance. To paraphrase it a bit, it's a response to more classical ways of software development processes. By more classical, I mean waterfall-oriented. So processes where you design first, or you do an action first, and then you do another action, then you do another action. Agile is more about going in cycles and focusing on high delivery. The Agile is Agile processes are usually made based on the Agile manifesto and the principles behind it. What I mean by agility is something a bit more mundane, and that's just the ability to move quickly and easily, or to think quickly and in an intelligent way. So we can really see here some differences. Agile, with a capital A, is really a set of processes, a set of frameworks, while agility is a more general term. So let's give some background. Some examples of Agile. I think one example that most of us are familiar with is, of course, Scrum, which is normally on a team-based. And we also have the scaled version of Scrum that's called Nexus, which is when you try to have more Scrum teams. Not too many, but it can work as well. We also have less known Agile frameworks like Spotify that still is used for scaling Agile, and it works really differently from Nexus. You have Edge, which is more about digital transformation than software development life cycles, which is also another response to something. And of course you have the almighty SAFe that you might like it or dislike it, but it's there, and it is an Agile framework, at least in the name. And you also have more esoteric stuff, like the Accenture Auto Scrum framework, which was specifically developed for automotive industry. I think maybe there are a couple of companies that like this. I personally don't, but yeah, that's also part of Agile. So we have all these frameworks. The characteristic of these frameworks is that they try to not be linear in the way that they deliver value to the customer. Of course, it's harder to see in something like Auto Scrum, but if we go back to something like Edge, we really have a cycle of reinforcing feedback. And of course, in Scrum, we know that we have the sprint cycle of at the end of each sprint, we do review retrospectives, and then we start a new sprint. Okay. And of course, we cannot talk about Agile without mentioning that there are a lot of certifications there. I just put one example per each that I could think of here, but if we focus on just one organization, we have something like 20 or 30 certifications per each. All right, and let's give some background of agility. Specifically, agility, what that means in the context of our profession of software development. And what we really mean by agility, yes, it's about moving quickly, but not necessarily moving fast. It's about moving as quickly as possible. what we really mean by agility is having this cycle of experimenting with something, observing how it behaves, and then adapting what we just did. So, for instance, if we're developing a new product, we start with a feature, we collect feedback from the customer, and then we change the feature so that it better matches what the customer wants. And for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to refer this as method and not agility. Reason being that it will just get confusing after a while if I start to say agile and agility. I think it will make things harder to follow. So from now on, if I say method or methodical, I'm referring to this kind of agility, which is fast often, but not necessarily fast, it's more methodical. We do experimentation, observation, and adapting. This nice feedback loop. Okay, so Agile is bad, or at least that's where I want to start from. Agile practices have a lot of problems. They do look like a self-inflating bubble, especially if you do something like if you're a company that is embracing Agile, you start hiring certified people to get started, and then it feels like you have to hire more certified people to scale it up. So maybe you start with Scrum Masters, then you have Agile coaches, and then maybe you have Scrum developers. I think that's a thing. We have a certification for professional Scrum developer. And so it really feels like one of the main purposes of Agile is to bring money to the Agile corporation, to the Agile community. So yeah, it feels a bit like I'm in a self-inflating bubble. And of course there's also a lot of marketing stuff. We don't call project managers because that's bad, and that comes from a bygone era in which projects need to be managed. No, we are not talking about projects, we're talking about products. So we have product managers and product owners instead of project manager. Likewise, we have other terms that we don't really like anymore and we call them differently. All these kind of things. In the end, though, that's just marketing. Right? It's just we're making sure that we call things for fancy names because that way we can sell certifications about it. And I won't deny that sometimes it does feel like a cult. I have been in contact with people that define themselves as Scrum evangelists. And I mean, last time I checked, Agile is not a religion. So I've seen, and we don't even have a good book about it, so there's nothing to be evangelical for it. But we do have people that do think that Agile is the only way, that Agile is the real way, and that you should not do waterfall because it's evil. That's silly, but it does happen. So yeah, Agile is not a good thing, but it does have its perks. All these frameworks, even though they have a lot of defects, they are also very well documented, usually. Maybe an exception is Scrum, that the documentation is deliberately lacking, but that's just because it's an open framework, so you can adapt it to your specific case. And SAFe has a lot of documentation, so if you're starting from scratch, even if you don't want to hire a professional, you can just get into the documentation and yeah, you can read it, you can have a lot of resources about it. Also, we do have clear use cases for these frameworks. We know that if you have a project with very little uncertainty, you should not do Agile practices. You're fine with waterfall. And every sensible Agile coach will tell you that. Likewise, some of these frameworks are specifically for a market. The Accenture Auto Scrum that I mentioned earlier, that was specifically developed for the automotive market. So it wouldn't make sense to apply it to a different kind of business. And also we know the limitations. Scrum works for a single team. Scaling Scrum to multiple teams doesn't really work. And well, it might work, but it's a challenge on its own. Nexus aims to provide some answers to that, but also Nexus is meant to scale to up to 4, 5, maybe 10 teams. Again, clear limitations. All these limitations are not hidden. They are explicitly stated in the documentation. Furthermore, if you have no experience whatsoever with Agile practices, these frameworks, they do provide a very good starting point. They have they give you a set of steps to go through, and that's fine. Maybe later you can change it, but it's better than starting from nothing. A lot of people put a lot of effort in defining those frameworks, and the reason was not only to make money out of it, but to actually deliver value to the customer. And at the end of all, we shouldn't forget that all the Agile frameworks are just products. And like all products, it really depends on your use cases whether they will be helpful or not. They are not a religion. They're just something that you buy or that you start to adopt, and maybe it will help your life. Or maybe not. So to summarize, Agile is bad. It has bad things, but not always. It's bad sometimes. And yeah, I'd like to start also that method is good. Being methodical is good. It has a lot of advantages. It's a very simple process to follow that as humanity we applied in several fields, not only software development. Basically everything we do, we start from an iteration, we see how it goes, and then we improve on that. We make it better, we make it more efficient. It promotes an evidence-driven approach to problem solving. So if you have a situation where you don't really know what's going on, following a methodical approach means that you collect evidence, that you base your next step on facts and not just on intuition. You still need intuition, but you can iron out where that intuition goes. And it also assumes that uncertainty is part of the process. You don't know exactly where you're going, so you're being methodical in such a way that you don't stray out from your path. That you make sure that you adjust your direction as you go. So it has a lot of good quality. And it is nice. However, it does have drawbacks. Being methodical is very expensive. If you want to observe a result, you need to be able to do so. That means that if you don't have already built-in processes or tools to observe how your software is doing, for example, then you have to build them. That is expensive on its own. Another reason why it is expensive is that you have to take some time to evaluate the results. So that means, for instance, that after 2 or 3 weeks, you take a day off just analyzing data and see what your next step is going to be. All these things, they do add effort. Another thing about being methodical is that it does require a lot of discipline. It's very easy to go from being methodical to just being chaotic. If we're just going fast, if we're just trying new things without taking the time to evaluate and see what works, well, that's not methodical. That's not agility. That's just chaos, and it leads to no benefit whatsoever. Furthermore, because it's evidence-driven, that means that as professionals, we have to take emotions out of it, and that requires discipline. So if the solution that we really like doesn't work, we have to let that go and try something else, regardless of how much effort or how much we thought that was a great idea. And you can't be methodical if your company does not allow for it. If the company sees every drawback as a point of failure, everything that doesn't really work as a loss, you can't really be methodical, because the company will not give you the chance to learn from mistakes. And so yeah, it has disadvantages. So to sum it up, the method is good in general. It provides a lot of benefits, but we have to be careful about it, and we have to keep things in mind. So of course, the reason why these two concepts share very similar terms is that they work really well together. I mean, I'm not saying that you can't be methodical without using Agile. Of course you can, and you can also use Agile without being methodical, which is not great, but you can definitely do it. But using them together really builds on allows you to synergize and to progress, building on the strengths of each other. An example of where they might work well together is when you're starting a new project. Suppose that you're starting a new project in which the end goal is not really clear. Maybe you're a startup and you're figuring out your best product. Then it does make sense to be methodical on the most critical topic. Maybe when you're developing your most critical topic is getting something to production, making sure that your infrastructure can support your target load. And that's the thing you should be methodical about. But because it's expensive to be methodical, that's the only thing you should be methodical about. It's perfectly fine to start with solutions that you already know for the other problems. I bet that if you're starting a new project, you will not be methodical about the programming language to use. You'll probably just go with the language that you're most familiar with. And that's fine. And the same is with the software, software processes, with development processes. Start with an Agile framework, even a simple one like Scrum, and that allows you to be methodical on what matters. Because all the Agile frameworks have a cycle built in, you can use those natural stop points in the framework to observe your changes and decide on your path. Then once you're confident in your critical topic and everything is resolved there, well, then you can start to be methodical about something else. And eventually, I would say that you should be methodical about your processes. I think it's fine at the beginning to start with the Agile as it is, but after a while you'll probably notice that some things don't really work for your team, and then at that point you should change your process. I have worked with several teams, for instance, for which the length of the sprint planning session in Scrum is just too long if doing it by the book. And for most of the teams I worked with, a lot less time was more than enough. The same goes for a concept like refinement in Scrum. Every team does it differently, and that's perfectly fine, because once you build confidence, once you understand the most important thing is not the process, but what you deliver to your stakeholders, then you can also change the process in order to facilitate that. Another situation where working with the two things together can be useful is when we're talking about planning. In more classical ways, like in the waterfall ways, you would decide on a plan from very early in the process. And you say, okay, I want to go from the start at the left to the end at the right. And these are all the dots are the steps in between that I want to take, and you want the plan to go in that direction. But then while working, what would happen is that maybe one step is not available, and then you say, okay, we take a small detour, but we're still on track. And then you notice, I forgot that there was a dependency on another step, and so we take an extra step to go there. But it can also happen that you realize that something is not needed anymore, and you just go to the end. And while, of course, you can do this also with waterfall, because you don't have any built-in way to change your plan, what happens is that often you have to justify with your superiors or with your stakeholders why you're diverging from the original plan. If we go back to T0, what happens if we just assume this uncertainty? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need a plan. You need a plan also if you're doing methodical. You need a plan also if you're doing Agile. Just the plan looks a bit different from how it would in a more classical process development. And the way it would look different is that maybe it's more detailed for the things that come nearer, but it will be less detailed afterward. And that's because we know that the more something is in the future, the more it will be uncertain. And thus doesn't really make sense to spend too much time thinking about it. Of course, a plan in the Agile world is called differently. It might be called roadmap, but in the end of the day, it's more or less the same thing. And so when you work in cycles, at every step you can say, okay, this step I am going to rework what I'm going to do because new knowledge emerged, and next step something else emerges, and so on. The other advantage is that you don't have to commit to something at the beginning, which is also the moment that you have less knowledge of what's going to happen. You can commit to something as you gain knowledge, and that can be really, really powerful. Of course, that can only work if you build your product in such a way that it allows for cycles. That's where the concept of minimum viable product comes. Now, be careful that a minimum viable product is not a proof of concept. A proof of concept is something that we build knowing that we will throw it away. It's not production ready. A minimum viable product is a product. It's something that we can sell to our stakeholders and that we can get profit from. It's viable. That does mean that, of course, at the beginning, your minimum viable product maybe has only one feature, but it has to be a production-ready feature. That means that while you're developing it will you will take care of all the security implications, the load testing, and these kind of things to make sure that it can support your target audience. So it's very important to build a product with scalability in mind, because it's good if we can evaluate our processes on a regular basis, if we can observe on a regular basis, but if they're very hard to change on a regular basis, we're kind of wasting time and we're not really taking benefits from being methodic or using Agile. Another way that we can take advantage is with flexible software development. So remember that while what I described might look like TDD, test-driven development, that's not really it. Because while working with agility and with Agile, with methodical way, it might be a good idea to not really separate the people that think what the software should do and the people that implement the software. So the developer also has to know how the software fits in the architecture. So for instance, say that you're developing an integration with a system that doesn't really have a clear documentation. Yes, you can apply test-driven development, but because you don't really know how the integration behaves, your tests will not be clear at the beginning. But what you can do is to test against the integration as you develop. It also has the advantage that you can interrupt development at any time. If your development is incomplete by a deadline, you still tested parts of it. And that means that you can probably just wrap it up in that situation. Of course, that will likely create technical debt, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because you can go back to it later and just keep iterating over it. So what are my takeaways from here? And I show you some examples how things synergize. Of course, there is agility and method, that they are very different things. So it's not one versus the other. It's not that one is better than the other. They work on a very different level. For me, it's important that we do not reinvent the wheel. It's common practice when we start working on something that we try to reuse existing products if we can. And I believe that should be the same with development processes. So it makes a lot of sense to adopt Agile at the beginning, especially if the team is not already familiar with it. If the team is familiar with it, well, they can just start with a version of Agile that they already know, so that they can invest all their effort, or most of their effort, in what matters, whatever the case, whether that's just delivering a good initial minimum viable product, or that's figuring out the technical challenges of deploying the software. But eventually, it is important that the development process follows the natural life cycle of the team, because otherwise it can be an impediment. and can just be in the way. Do you have any questions?